Welcome back to Strange Form. Today we're going to be looking at one of the more interesting Kickstarters of the last several years, which is Skeletron's take on the 1980s classic Roboskull. In the Roboskull Mark II, one part Star Wars design, one part Masters of the Universe. This thing was an incredible bridging of design philosophies between the fantastical and science fiction. Originally appearing in Palitoy's Action Force line, not to be confused with Bobby Vala's Action Force. The Roboskull here was part of the European release of many of the G.I. Joe figures, which sported a completely different storyline, as well as some figures and vehicles that never came to the States. But the most famous and infamous of those was the Roboskull, a ground-to-space vehicle used by the Red Shadows, the Cobra-esque menace in the Action Force storyline. But let's take a look at what's in the box. But what is the Roboskull? Well, it's an aerospace VTOL craft, or vertical takeoff and landing vehicle. Originally created for Palitoy's version of the relaunch of the G.I. Joe series in the early 1980s. This is a vehicle that we never got here in the States, and became something of a myth or legend amongst collectors. But why do we have it? Well, because about 1,500 backers pledged almost $700,000 to get this thing made. Basically, a reimagining of the original from the 1980s, but in a classified large vehicle scale. But they also set out to make this dual purpose, in that it has two different cockpit setups that accept both 6-inch figures and 3 3/4 figures, both of which they either have been releasing or will be releasing later this year. And this Kickstarter ended up launching the Minnesota-based Skeletron Studios to stardom across the toy sphere, basically pushing them to be one of the most talked about new studios of the last several years. On top of that, their Kickstarter campaign got off to a rocky start, as they weren't able to meet many of the deadlines, largely because this thing took longer to develop than they thought it would. But once they got the ball rolling, they really did produce something that made ripples throughout the industry. Almost a HasLab, the Roboskull is a large accessory-laden vehicle that looks perfectly at home next to the Hiss tank or the Dragonfly. On top of that, the Skeletron company produced several small figures, large figures, a board game, and a re-release of the Action Force comic book, again the European counterpart to G.I. Joe. With an incredible fantasy sci-fi design aesthetic, this thing is definitely one of the more interesting vehicles that I've ever seen produced for a military line. On the back we have the packaging list. On the top we have some of the highlights, the artwork of the included figure on the side. On the bottom we have another art piece with the credits. So big score for presentation. But let's look at what's in the box. Alright, so this section is probably going to seem like a bad 1950s Godzilla dub, as the audio file corrupted, causing me to have to voice over this section. First we have one of the wings, the lightning breath, which is cool. It's actually kind of a heavy piece. 2 blast effects. Now let's flip it over, and in the other tray we have the other wing, as well as the other 2 blast effects. On that side, we also have the eye socket Gatling guns and missiles. Now on to the main event, we have the fuselage, which is a giant skull, just short of being the size of a real human skull. Out of the box, it's actually quite heavy. We also have the chin cannon and the alternate 6-inch figure cockpit seat. There's actually quite a bit of detail in this, and I have to say this is one of the things that really sold me on it, as I don't really collect the 3 3/4 figures, so the ability to fold this into my 1/12 collection was again one of the biggest selling points. We also have the 3 3/4 Red Shadows Blood Wolf. The likeness is actually based on the designer of the original Roboskull. Lastly, we have the carbonite containment chamber, or the carrying case for the Skeledrones. This thing actually has quite a bit of heft, and in hand is really impressive. The fit and finish is really well done. The only complaint I might have is that some of the screw holes are open, and it would have been nice if they put a peg in there. Here we have the instruction booklet with the build instructions. They're pretty straightforward, and they also show you how you can convert the seat into a hover seat vehicle. On top of that, they give us an extra sticker sheet for the cockpit. The cockpit already has stickers applied, but I guess this is just in case they peel up. Next, it comes with the Roboskull Mark II poster that shows all of the different possible configurations for the vehicle. I think I might actually frame this one and put it behind the vehicle, which I plan on hanging from the ceiling. All told, we have about 23 items in the box, plus a glow-in-the-dark sticker sheet, which are as follows: the lightning breath, the blast effects, the eye socket Gatling guns, the glow-in-the-dark eye socket missiles. These are interesting. They are little 3mm Diaclone adapters that allow for you to use 3mm peg holes for accessories from Diaclone. When not in use, these can also be stored in the mouth portion on the lower missile rack. Again, we have the 6-inch figure chair, the chin cannons, which can be used in tandem with the 6-inch figure chair, box that can either hold a figure, or the skeledrones. The skeledrones are actually surprisingly posable, having little ball joints for both the legs and the head. And then we have the plastic wine glass bottom, which can be used as a floating effect for either the chin cannon and chair vehicle or the skeledrone storing box. As you can see close up, these are handsomely painted and well weathered. They have a very Stormtrooper meets Starship Troopers kind of look to them, and are a nice little addition to the package. Each of the skeledrones has a little peg on the back of its head that allows for you to plug them into their carrying case. They also have a blast effect port at the bottom, which allows for you to put blast effects in, making it look like they have rocket propulsion. I do really like the fact that this box is on a hinge, so it won't be so easy to have the lid pop off and fly under the table. The entire box fits in this cavity in sort of a tension wedge that keeps it firmly in place. I decided to put my glow-in-the-dark 084 sticker on the back because it looked like a license plate. As you can see, all over the box there are both see-through plastic details as well as quite a few paint details. So this is a neat little accessory. Now the clear plastic wine glass bottom allows for you to display the thing as if it's floating, i.e. like Carbonite Han being loaded into Slave 1. The cockpit easily accepts either chair style, but mine is pretty much going to have the 6-inch figure one from here on out. And as for that 6-inch chair, with the chin cannon it converts into a little vehicle, which actually has a backpack peg on the back of the chair, which is an awesome addition, as well as a place to store one of the weapons on the side of the chair. On top of all of that, there are 2 backpack pegs inside the cockpit, so they really did think about stowing the accessories, and this is something I wish Hasbro would do a lot more of. Alright, now that we're into the pose gallery, I actually wanted to go over a little bit of how this thing came to be, which is actually quite interesting. Back in the early 1980s, the company Palitoy was re-envisioning the Action Man series, the British counterpart of the G.I. Joe line, doing the same thing the US market was doing, which was scaling it down from a 12-inch figure to a 3 3/4 figure, namely to compete with the Star Wars line. And though this line eventually started bringing figures over from the US G.I. Joe line, their initial release had some really interesting and different designs. And one of the most famous of these was the Roboskull, designed by Bob Birkin, who at the time was a chief designer for Palitoys, working on everything from Star Wars to the Action Force line. And so you can kind of see the fingerprints of someone who worked on both those toy lines with this thing, i.e. its resemblance to a TIE fighter. Fast forward to 2020, where Ben Conway and Mark O'Byrne, 2 long-term friends, came together over the idea of creating a Kickstarter to reinvigorate this design. And what an interesting Kickstarter it was. Launching in 2021, the initial idea was to bring an updated version of the Roboskull to market, and they reached out to the original creator to help them design it. With Bob Birkin aboard, they put together a talented crew of toy designers in order to flesh out something that would make big ripples in the industry, and it did exactly that, bringing on over 1,500 backers to the tune of more than $600,000. It remains one of the most successful toy Kickstarters in history. But as the Kickstarter went along, it snowballed into something bigger, with them adding everything from O-ring figures all the way to 1/12 scale figures, as well as a re-release of the original comic series, and a board game, not to mention all of the extra accessories they'll be releasing over the year. So this little Minnesota startup actually became quite the talk of the town, impressing the toy industry and being hailed as one of the best toys of the year by some of the biggest reviewers. And the interesting thing is, it actually does deserve all of the hype, but it wasn't all roses and rainbows. The Kickstarter took much longer from development to production than I think they were anticipating, and this got some fans really antsy and brought some online complaints, as it took 3 years from the beginning to it actually hitting the market. But good things come to those who wait, and they actually did end up producing exactly what they had promised, a sleek reimagining of a desired toy from a limited market. And it really is one of the most interesting vehicles that I've ever seen for a science fiction line, and definitely something that stands out in anyone's collection. And one of the things that I really appreciate is that Skeletron decided to produce way more than they needed just to satisfy the backers, allowing for those in the general market to pick up one after release. And it blows my mind, with these still in stock and easily picked up, how many of them are on eBay marked up to scalper prices. And with the success of this thing, I really do wonder where they're going to be going next. As like with Fresh Monkey Fiction, they are a brand new toy maker on the scene that has made a huge splash in the industry, and I can't see them simply fading away after this success. So I'm excited to see what else they'll produce. 2024 and on into 2025 has definitely been an interesting time for upstart toy makers. From Bobby Valla to Gridiron Studios, there are quite a few out there giving Hasbro a run for their money. And with Hasbro repeatedly dropping the ball this last year, I can definitely see someone coming for the title. Now, like I said before, I don't think I'll be opening the 3 3/4 figure, largely because I don't have any more in my collection. I even sold off all of my Haya Alien figures in the Giant Purge. But as far as quality goes, this is actually pretty slick. And a fun aside about this one, the likeness is actually based on the original Palatoys designer Bob Birkin. I will definitely say that these figures do tempt me into the 3-inch world, but it's something I'm not ready to dip my foot into. But that's not going to stop us from having a little close-up. Much like the G.I. Joe line, he has a file card on the back, and we can see all of the other figures they'll be releasing soon. The figure comes with a blaster, a helmet, a backpack, and 2 Wolverine-style wrist gauntlets, with 3 blades that can be stored on the backpack. The file card tells us that he's skillful, ruthless, and utterly unpredictable. Bloodwolf is the most feared Red Shadows pilot, the brilliant mind who birthed the sinister Roboskull. He alone dared to test pilot the experimental craft, boasting a strike count far exceeding any other. This veteran cosmonaut has retained his razor-sharp edge through countless treacherous missions. In fact, recent enhancements from the latest Red Shadows technology have rendered the Bloodwolf deadlier than ever. Living only for the hunt, Bloodwolf has no family, no friends, claims he was raised by wolves, and I believe him. File name: Birkin Boff. Primary military specialty: special weapons development. Secondary military specialty: aerospace pilot. Birthplace: Kiruna, Sweden. So, what are my final thoughts on this thing? Well, first let's start off with some of my complaints, and these are small, but I really wish that they would have given us either 4 of the eye socket canister bombs or 4 of the Gatling guns. The reason is that these fit nicely into the peg holes for all 4 of the blasters. The eye socket ones can be put on the firing effect or peg straight into the cannon. And the Gatling guns that fit in the eye sockets can also be put on all 4 of these. So not giving us 4 actually limits the amount of display options. So one thing I wish they would do is release maybe an accessory set with more of these options for these peg holes. One of the other things that I wish is that they had filled in some of the screw holes here. This is something that HasLabs always do, and a lot of other toy manufacturers have started to do, which is to put a peg in the screw holes so they don't show up so much. It's not a huge deal, and it's an easily remedied thing with some modeler's putty or modeler's spackle, but then you have to match the paint scheme and everything. So it's just one of those things I wish they would have done, but it's not a huge deal. Now this last one, this is something that I messed up on, which is before you put on these wings, because of the way that they attach and they're very difficult to get back off without ruining them, you need to decide whether or not you want to put on the glow-in-the-dark stickers, as they are very difficult to get lined up on the inside portion of the wing. So don't do it the way that I did, as I spent a long time fiddling these and they're still not completely straight. If you decide you want to put on the glow-in-the-dark stickers, do it before you even start putting the thing together. Now, I decided to go for mine with a Gundam panel marker and bring out all the panel lines. I think this is actually a really good candidate for that kind of work, as it has a lot of panel lines and they look absolutely awesome once brought out, giving this thing a more Setsabi sort of Gundam mechanical look. But as you can see, I actually outlined just about everything with the panel markers. But any small complaints aside, this thing is absolutely awesome. Now, some of the things I wanted to go through that are difficult to tell in just the pose gallery are the wings. So they have several different flight modes. There's this one, which is the sort of TIE fighter mode. Then there is a sort of TIE interceptor look, and a very closed TIE interceptor look. And then it's got the landing mode. And you can tell there is a heavy ratchet on each position. So it's very easy to get the thing into the position you want it in without it being slightly off. And here it is in landed mode. The Carbonite freeze box full of Skeledrones is easy to get in and out, and uses a small tensioner loop on the bottom to pin the thing in position. As for the two front cannons and the rear cannons actually accept the over-the-muzzle Action Force muzzle flares. So not the ones that pin into the muzzle, but the ones that actually go over it. The front will actually accept the Action Force muzzle blasts, but from my understanding, there are specific laser blasts that are for it that you'll be able to get with the stand. The stand is something I wish came with this, largely because it's another $30 plus shipping, and this thing is already running you around $250. So that's pushing $300, which probably is still worth it, but when you consider the fact that the likes of the Dragonfly were under $300 and came with a stand as well as many moving parts, I do wish that that's something that they included with this one. But I also understand that they're a much smaller company, and it's going to be difficult for them to add all of these things, as the price is already going to give them razor-thin margins. So I think buying things like the stand and some extra accessories actually come down to just supporting the company. But all in all, I think this is actually one of the coolest vehicles that I've seen in a long time, and a really interesting update on the original. So this is one I highly suggest picking up if you're a fan of 1/12 scale figures, or if you're a G.I. Joe classified collector, as it fits in really nicely with that line. Again, Skeletron, if you're listening, please add an extra accessory lot with a couple more of these or a couple more of the eyes. But other than that, you're doing great. And I also really like the 1/12 scale figures that you're releasing later this summer, so I think you're on a roll. I'd definitely like to see you guys do another vehicle, and I'm excited to see what you're up to next. Now I hope all of you enjoyed this dive into the SKELETRON ROBOSKULL MK II, and will join me next time as we look into Operation Monster Force. This episode, unfortunately, was a little bit late because of a plethora of small issues that kept me from getting it out, namely some corrupted audio files, as well as a couple of scenes that needed to be shot again because of those corrupted audio files. But I hope now that we're back on track, we'll get more episodes out more quickly. If you'd like to support the channel, please look up my Patreon. It should be in the description section. And as always, remember, never stop collecting.